Ladies and gentlemen, may I start this session? We have a small but distinguished audience, which I hope will increase in the course of our deliberations. I certainly hope so, because we have an exceptionally distinguished panel, which will become more distinguished in the course of the event when Caroline Cox joins us. She is at another session at the moment. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. We are a think tank operating here in Budapest. In general, our remit is a more political one than today's events. We tend to cover we tend to provide a forum for debate between conservatives and classical liberals on the one hand and their democratic opponents on the other. We are conservative in social and cultural matters. In economic questions, we are classical liberals, and in foreign policy, we're Atlanticists. But today's topic, as part of this very fine and important conference that's put on by the Hungarian government on combating Christian persecution, our role here is not the first time we have taken an interest in the whole topic of the persecution of religious believers. This is the third conference, in fact, this year in which we've done so. The other two conferences were, first of all, a conference entitled Invisible Victims, Religious Believers and Western Governments, which we held in London with a distinguished audience at the Reform Club with Father Kiley, who's on the platform today, playing a part in that. Then we were in New York. We joined the Anglosphere Society to take part in a conference, again, on the growing worldwide bias against Christianity, and this is our third event. We feel that this is an issue which is in fact, though obviously preeminently a religious issue, is also a cultural and political issue. When people are being persecuted for whatever reason, obviously, as decent people want to take action to solve it. And that is the topic of this panel. We are really asking the question that was once formulated by Lenin. What is to be done? We've had extremely eloquent and passionate and moving testimonies today from people from all over the world, testifying to the persecution and prejudice they meet in their own countries, and looking to people who are situated more favorably in Western Europe, Central Europe, and the United States, and other parts of the world, to come to their assistance and to give them assistance through prayer, of course, but also of a practical and political kind. So we're here on a very straightforward, above the board, and a pragmatic question. As I say, after we've seen and heard the testimonies of persecution and distress, what are we going to do about it? Well, again, you have in front of you the names of our distinguished contributors to this panel, and I'm not going to simply read them out again. I hope you will pay attention to them and already imbibe them. But I'm going to begin by asking Father Benedict Kiley, who has played a great role in attempting to help Christian communities in trouble, to begin by, first of all, briefly recapitulating perhaps what we know, and secondly, and more importantly, perhaps telling us what we can do and what we should do. Father Kiley.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much to John and the Danube Institute for inviting me. It's a great blessing to be the first speaker, because normally by the time you're the third speaker, the first to have said what you're going to say, and then you're not able to do it. So by Frank's time, he'll have to just say about 3 words. But my preamble, though, would be we were asked sort of to speak about the challenges, how we can challenge governments and agencies to do work. In a sense, I could begin pessimistically because, as we know, having heard all day, Western Europe is becoming even more challenging itself towards Christianity, and it's very hard work, but that shouldn't deter us in the battle that we're having to fight within our own culture, a culture that's now getting more and more hostile to Christianity. I'll give one example. I was at an event, in fact, it was the Hudson Institute a number of years ago, when a major journalist from a national network said to us, you know, in the newsrooms of America, and I would say probably the newsrooms of most of Western Europe, you are the enemy, meaning us, Christians. You are the enemy. Now, we all probably know that, but when it's actually said, it's quite striking. Archbishop Charles Chaput, the soon-to-retire Archbishop of Philadelphia, in his book, Render Unto Caesar, said, again, also very tellingly, they hate us. And he's talking about the intelligentsia, academia, etc. That kind of language is powerful, but it's, again, necessary. So with that preamble, I like the word challenge. Etymologically, the word challenge, of course, comes from the Old English to mean also accuse and protest. So we have to accuse sometimes and protest, obviously, about the lack of leadership, the lack of care for persecuted Christians. As we have short time, I've just got a few quick points to try and be practical. I would say, again, the example of Hungary is so marvelous because they are practical. And what they're doing is my first point, listening, going directly to the people. In this regard, I would use Schumacher's phrase, small is beautiful. These huge organizations often don't listen to the people on the ground. It's essential to listen. What Hungary Helps has done, leading the world, is to listen to the local church leaders. Often people think they have the answer, but when you listen, and not necessarily important big groups of officials and dignitaries, even, I have to say, bishops, sometimes when they go, people say what they want to hear. You've got to get right down on the ground and listen to the local people. So I think that's the first thing. These official tours that governments and agencies can go on. When I first went to Iraq, we drove past a huge compound, walled in, vast compound. And I said to my driver, what is that? He said, that's the UN. He said, do they ever come out? Do they help you? This was in 2015. I said, no, they haven't done anything for us. The churches were doing everything on the ground, feeding and housing. My second point would be very practical, I think, is training. Training diplomats, for example. There's a sort of an empty hole in many young people's lives, highly educated young people who go into the diplomatic corps or who work in these agencies. They're highly intelligent, they may have master's degrees, doctorates, but when they come to religion, there's an empty hole. It's very important for them to be trained to realize that religion is a worldwide important topic. The former ambassador for religious freedom of Canada, Dr. Andrew Bennett, who some of you know, he was the first and only Canadian ambassador for religious freedom under the Harper government. The Trudeau government got rid of the Office of Religious Freedom and called it the Office of Diversity. We won't even talk about that. But Dr. Bennett said one of his jobs was to train diplomats, that when they're working in different countries, they need to realize religion is important. It's not a side issue. I would also say, for example, journalists as well. Why are there no mainstream media journalists at this conference? A BBC journalist who was at an event at the Hungarian embassy a few weeks ago said that many of his colleagues believed that Victorian missionaries brought the faith to the Middle East, not the other way around. I mean, that's the kind of lack of knowledge of journalists, highly educated people. My third point may or may not be controversial, but again, it's practical. Foreign aid. I think we must challenge governments and agencies to make religious freedom a prerequisite for foreign aid. And if they are not participating in that, if they're not following through with that, foreign aid must be cut. Why are we still giving, for example, in Britain, we're still giving hundreds of thousands of pounds a year to Pakistan, to India, to countries that are actively persecuting religious minorities? Foreign aid must be cut. That's immensely practical and easy to do. And last is a little more controversial. We have to speak about immigration, but in the sense of making victims of genocide priorities for immigration? I know this is a very contentious issue with especially some of the patriarchs about leaving the Middle East, but my point would be help those who want to stay, help those who want to leave to leave. They're not contradictory. But when people want to leave who are victims of genocide, they must be given priority. Why would we not give victims of genocide priority at the top of the list? So just a few very practical points that I would begin with.
Thank you. Father Carley, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is an old colleague of mine from the Hudson Institute, where he's a senior fellow and specializes in religious liberty, but he is also professor of, religious freedom in Baylor University. He's also a Liverpudlian. We come from roughly the same area. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce him because his work at Hudson, and I was in the office next door, has done a tremendous amount to bring the questions of Christian persecution to the attention of policymakers in Washington. And again, this gives him a unique standpoint from which to address the question, what is to be done? Paul Marshall.
Thank you very much, John. What I want to do is, I think, try and frame the question. I wrote a book called On the Persecuted Church called Their Blood Cries Out. It came out in 1997. I think it was the first large book on the subject. A question I had then is, why don't people know about this and why don't they act on it? So I want to address some of these questions because religious freedom and the persecuted church is an issue which needs to be framed so people can get some sort of grasp of it. The first thing I want to say is for all of us to emphasize the importance of religion in human affairs. The tendency right now is to think the three things that drive human beings are money, sex, and power. And they do a lot of driving, but it's money, sex, power, and faith. And religion consistently gets ignored. Maybe if I can give a couple of somewhat humorous examples. Next week will be the 40th anniversary of the accession of the Ayatollah Khomeini as supreme leader of Iran. So I'll take some examples from that. There was a little-known journalist in the United States who was a stringer for Time magazine, which was an important magazine then, and said, we need to, watching the tumult in Iran, the Ayatollahs, the demonstrations, that we need to write an article about these Ayatollahs and their background and what they believe. And was told that was irrelevant, ignore it. After the revolution took place, his star rode a lot, and he became a contributing editor to Time magazine in the space of 6 months. There was another occasion, the strategic theorist Edward Luttwak describes how in 1979 there was one proposal made to the Central Intelligence Agency to study these Ayatollahs and their religious beliefs. And this proposal was, I think it was Luttwak made the proposal himself, but it was turned down on the grounds that it would be mere sociology, which is intelligence speak for irrelevant academic verbiage. That's a good definition of sociology, but in this case it was misleading. But they said, well, the military's on board, the merchants are on board, the upper class, all the centers of power in a society were on board with the Shah. It's just these mad religious guys running around in the streets, and that amounts to nothing. And so they were surprised with that takeover. If any of you remember the hostage crisis, why was a hostage crisis? Because there were hostages. Why were the hostages? Because the American embassy was full of people and they hadn't shredded their documents. Why? Because they didn't expect anything to happen, because there were just these religious maniacs in the street. And so we had a year-long hostage crisis, which lost Jimmy Carter the election, and I think got Ronald Reagan elected. So ignoring religion can have sometimes good consequences, I think. But it's very dangerous. In this case, just ignoring a revolution taking place right in front of your eyes and say, it's not real. Some more contemporary examples, talking to a senior US State Department official about Nigeria and Fulani tribesmen slaughtering Christians. He said, we're trying to de-religionize the conflict. I don't know what that means. Is he saying it's religious, but we're going to ignore that? Or somehow we're going to get the religion out of it? I don't know, but the whole point is they didn't want to deal with religion. And of course, take one more, the New York Times, in asking why Fulani and Boko Haram are killing thousands of Christians, said the reason is, of course, climate change. I'm not joking. So the pattern of ignoring the religious dimension is still very widespread. And we need to tackle that mindset before people would even take religious freedom seriously. So I think this needs to be raised again and again and again, and should be part of the education of journalists. Another one is with governments and businesses. We wanted to check into business and economic matters more generally. Why should they be involved? How can we convince them? Well, we could say it's the right thing, which it is. Often that doesn't get you very far with governments or businesses. But we can also say it's in your interest. There is now a wealth of research. I even did a little with Ted Malloch 10, 12 years ago, but more with the Pew Forum, the sociologist Jonathan Fox, and especially Brian Grimm of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, arguing for businesses. If you want to be a good business, that is, you want to make money, you ought to be concerned with this. There are now a wealth of data showing that not only does religious freedom, and especially the freedom of Christians, correlate with increased economic growth, increased entrepreneurial activity, an increase in the status of women, but also it's a causative factor. You can do time series analysis and show this is helping that. So to convince businesses, if you tolerate violations of religious freedom, either within your company or outside it or in the places you operate, you are damaging yourself. Your shareholders should sue you for that. So the self-interest, also with governments, it contributes to political stability. Those correlations are very strong there. So we need to sell the self-interest side of religious freedom. And then a third one, a particular interest of mine, is the question, especially in the Muslim world, but now also in the West, of blasphemy. And there are many religious freedom problems. We've been hearing a lot about them at the conference in the Muslim majority world. But I particularly want to focus on the question of blasphemy because it's sort of the gateway to much of the other repression. What happened in Iran, there was a person who converted to Christianity, Ahmad Saeed, and there was a call for the death penalty. An Afghan magazine editor published an article which said, does Islam really require us to have the death penalty for apostates? So he was accused of blasphemy and imprisoned, which means you can't discuss the subject of apostasy or of child marriage or other things. Blasphemy means so many other issues cannot be discussed. So it needs to be a central focus for us. And that also means in the West, we have to get away from these so-called hate speech laws, which are blasphemy laws in fancy dress. Nina Shea, who we mentioned, and I did a 56-country study of blasphemy laws and accusations. The major problems are social rather than governmental, though governments are bad enough. We found they are always vague. They can never be kept in bounds. That is, you can't limit their focus no matter how much people say, we're only after this. Doesn't happen. A third element is the principal victims are religious minorities, and a fourth element is it empowers radicals, because they are the ones willing to use that as a weapon, whether we're talking about in Europe or Pakistan, against more moderate voices. It's hardly ever done the other way around. So I think these are three sort of framing background issues to the persecution of the church that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is someone who has a background in activism and in investigation, in research and advocacy. Sam Mason has completed a degree recently at Cambridge in international relations, but a much more important part of your credential this evening is you've actually been abroad helping numerous humanitarian projects in Nigeria, Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Thailand, and other points east. So you have actually been involved in helping people to resist the attacks on them, and you've seen how they develop. I'm very interested, and so with the audience, in telling us how you think we should be going about dealing with this question.
Thank you, John. I think for many of us, the questions that we're grappling with through much of this conference this afternoon especially, I think are questions that a lot of us have already spent some time thinking about. How is it that we, representing different organisations, perhaps with limited resources, how is it that we can begin to persuade governments and those at the very top to care about people at the very bottom? What's the best way to encourage them to take on board our concerns? And for many of you who've been working in this sphere longer than I have, I expect. I think I must be one of the youngest contributors at this year's conference. But I think the answers to those questions would be mixed. You will have experienced some successes, perhaps experienced some failures almost certainly as well. Because the reality is that more often than not, no matter how loudly we shout, those in positions of influence, those in mainstream media, they turn a deaf ear to suffering. And I was struck by something that the Syriac patriarch said this morning. He said, "Our cries have not been heard." And that's really the essence of what brings us together. It's what Baroness Cox, who's my boss, it's what she calls the double twist of the knife. We visit places off the radar screen and out of sight of the world's media. We see tragedies of death and destruction. We try to raise concerns, we raise it with our governments, but more often than not, they turn a deaf ear to suffering. Now, I've less than 10 years' experience in this area, so I certainly don't pretend to have all of the answers. But if I may, I'd like to share what I think is the most important lesson that I've learnt since working in this sphere. It's not a particularly original concept, we've already mentioned it twice, but it is something that's repeatedly overlooked, certainly where I'm working in the Houses of Parliament, in the corridors of Whitehall and the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the lesson I've learned is this, that sustainable change is only possible when we partner with local people. Sustainable change is only possible when we partner with local people. And the reasons for that, you'll already be familiar with. They're quite simple. Firstly, because local people are deeply committed to their communities. Secondly, because local people have an intimate knowledge of the cultural, economic, political, social climate that they're working in, often even more so than even the most experienced academic or UN official. And thirdly, because local partners are the foundation and front line of a humanitarian response. They're able to adapt quickly to the chaotic and rapidly changing circumstances that they find themselves in. So if international organizations have to withdraw because of security or because of sanctions, or if their own governments aren't allowing humanitarian aid, as is the case in Blue Nile State and the Danube Mountains in Sudan, it's the local community that's left single-handedly managing the crisis. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that other perspectives aren't important. Of course, there's lots that we can learn from sociologists, social anthropologists, historians, even politicians, I would say. But the lessons I've learned, I'll say again, is this, that the most important voice out of all of those voices, I believe, is the voice of the local people, those who themselves find themselves oppressed and marginalized or persecuted because of their faith. And I'm going to refer as well to the same example of Paul, of what's happening in Nigeria. For 5 years now, the Islamist Fulani militants have launched a campaign of terror in northern and central belt states. Thousands of Christians have been killed. Hundreds of churches have been burned to rubble, and entire communities have been forced to abandon their homes and farmland. And what's happening is that militant herdsmen are seeking to impose a monochrome ideology similar to Boko Haram's with violence on those who refuse to comply. And according to the Nigerian House of Representatives, what's happening there in Plateau State, that's a genocide. They've called it that. And I visited some of the worst affected areas, and I've seen the tragedies of death and destruction. I've stood in the rubble of a pastor's home who was massacred in front of his congregation. And one of the survivors told me, he said they were trained terrorists with guns. They killed those who couldn't run, the aged, the children, and the blind. The pastor was the first casualty. They surrounded him, they killed him, and then they rejoiced. And we'll all be familiar with similar and countless testimonies of beheadings and massacres in places like Nigeria. So in an effort to fulfill our mandate and to be a voice for the voiceless, or those whose voices aren't heard, we try to use our resources, they're limited resources, but we try to use them to draw attention to their stories via meetings with government ministers, speeches in parliament, articles in newspapers, submissions to inquiries, whatever it may be, because we're convinced that understanding the insights of local people is the first and most important step to combating their persecution. Back in the United Kingdom, the British government describe this, they call it a situation, what's happening in Nigeria. They say it's nothing to do with, or at least has very little to do with religion or ideology. They refer to the Fulani insurgency as a consequence of population growth. They say it's due to land and water disputes. They call it a tit-for-tat clash between farmers and herders. And quite frankly, such a characterization of the conflict in those terms is an insult to those who have suffered so much. I'm not saying that the causes of violence aren't complex, of course they are. But to simply describe these as a consequence of desertification or population growth or whatever it may be, it's too one-dimensional, it's too simplistic. According to the local people, you talk to the local people, this is blatant religious persecution. That's what's happening in northern and central belt states. People are targeted and killed and forced off their land because of their faith. That's the view of the local people, that's the root cause of the conflict, that's the voice I think we should be listening to over and above the other voices. Yet it's these insights that, certainly in the UK, that are somehow seen as less important than the voices of the so-called experts on these issues. And I'm sorry to say that I've been in meetings with government ministers and they've put forward all manner of sociological, historical, geographical reasons behind this conflict, but they're denying, to a great extent, this religio-ideological dimension and really missing the point altogether. So that's my point, really, and the lesson that I've learned, I think, since working in this space, that when governments are forming their policies, they're essentially weighing up different voices. They're deciding which voices to prioritize, and some of those voices are louder than others. And I think it's our responsibility, whatever sphere we're working in, whether it's in government or media or in churches, whatever it may be, to try and raise the voice of those who are persecuted, those on the front lines of faith and freedom.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a very powerful testimony. I could perhaps add one example to your examples and then Paul's examples of the mass media grossly underestimating the impact of religion on human affairs. It would be that after the Pope John Paul II had visited Poland in 1979, historic visit, which we now know had enormous geopolitical consequences, the New York Times said the reception he received shows that the Polish people are pleased to have a Polish Pope, whom they revere, but this will not have any further major consequences in relations between the European countries. Well, that's as big a misjudgment as you can make in this matter. So, I believe I believe it's the case. So I'd like to, so Sam, thank you very much indeed. Frank, you come from a very interesting and in this context perhaps unusual background. You come from the background of having had extremely responsible positions in the American government related to defense. You were appointed by Ronald Reagan to I think it's one of the most senior positions in the Pentagon. And subsequent to that, you went on and founded the Center for Security Policy, of which you're still president, and which deals with, of course, a wide range of security questions. But this is one which you have taken an interest in and become very active in. Perhaps I can ask you to speak from that particular standpoint.
John, thank you for allowing me to be part of this program. I'm in awe of those who have been at work on this field, as you have much longer than I. And as a newcomer to it, this may sound presumptuous to be able to suggest that I've got any insights that haven't occurred to all of you before, but permit me to just do a shout out to my colleague Didi Laugesen, who has taught me much about these problems and is helping me with a new project. I'm actually the executive chairman these days of the Center for Security Policy, and in my spare time I'm helping with something we've called the Save the Persecuted Christians Coalition, and now we're trying to turn it into a proper grassroots movement in the hope that we can do something additive, complementary to, and we think uniquely needed at this moment in time. I think, again, for the purposes of calibration, it's important to remind us all that, as we've been hearing about, we're dealing with what I believe is the worst humanitarian crisis in human history, with something on the order of 327 million Christians being persecuted around the world. As it happens, that is almost precisely the size of the population of the United States, which is an important way, I think, particularly for those of us in the United States, to think about this, that every man, woman, and child amongst us is equivalent to what is now being afflicted elsewhere, mostly elsewhere. And I'm going to come to that in a moment, picking up on something Paul said. What we're trying to do with Save the Persecuted Christians is, as I say, hopefully complementary to the great work that many are doing to relieve the suffering of Christians around the world, notably and especially the woman who has just arrived. Perfect timing. Hello, Baroness Cox.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sorry, I had to speak the other session, so I do apologize. Thank you.
We appreciate you doing double bidding here. I was just saluting you as an exemplar of someone who is working, along with Sam, of course, to relieve the suffering of persecuted Christians. The idea of our effort is to go beyond that in a way, in fact, that Brian has talked about a moment ago, and that is holding those who are responsible for the persecution accountable for what they're doing. And at long last, we propose to impose costs on them for doing what they're doing. Something that has, alas, largely been absent to this point, meaning that it is essentially something that people can engage in with complete impunity. If anything, they think there's nothing but upsides, whether it's, divine rewards because you're doing what Allah has commanded you to do, or because it's what the party thinks you should do, or it's because the dictator in your particular locale is calling upon you to do. I'm very gratified that at a meeting that the Hungarian foreign minister and his Brazilian counterpart convened on the margins of the UN General Assembly recently, Lord Ahmed of the United Kingdom actually referred to the fact that his government, Brian, has adopted a policy of beginning to condition foreign aid on the recipient not engaging in persecution of Christians or other religious minorities. Brian has indicated this ought to be easy. In my experience, it's not generally, though I'm heartened by reports that have been circulating in our country that the United States government is looking at doing the same thing, which would be, again, very gratifying because we've been arguing for 2 years that this is something that ought to be done, and I'm prayerful that it will be. And for that matter, why stop there? Foreign military sales, where those are in prospect, should also be similarly conditioned, as I think should generally the character of the political relationship. I mean, you can have diplomatic ties, but, well, I must say, feting Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the White House would be, to my way of thinking, something that ought not to be done, given his conduct with respect, among others, to persecuting Christians. Let me just add something else that we have tried to do, because it is, in the end, still a governmental responsibility to take any of those sorts of steps to impose costs. One of our colleagues in our coalition is the Honorable Frank Wolf, a longtime leader in the issue of religious freedom in the United States, known, I think, to everybody here. Frank Wolf has said, well, something else that we could do is hold the enablers of persecution accountable. So we've undertaken to call out and raise up, as an example, a prominent law firm that engages in lobbying Washington government officials as well as people elsewhere around the world, I believe, by the name of Squire Patton Boggs. This may not be a household name to many of you, but it is well known in the United States. It has such estimable figures as the former Speaker of the House and the former majority and minority leaders of the United States Senate in its retinue of lobbyists. It also has among its clients Communist China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Cameroon, and the Palestinian Authority. All of them pedigreed state sponsors of persecution, mostly of Christians, but in some cases others as well. We've called on them to drop these people, these governments. We've gone to 15 of their offices around the United States and urged the local management to weigh in with the Washington and their headquarters. Thus far, I must say, without appreciable effect, but it is raising their profile as exemplars of the kinds of people who are facilitating persecution by, at the minimum, legitimating and protecting their clients, if not actually getting them various benefits from the United States government with respect to foreign aid or what have you. I want to close with two last points. One is that we ought to think carefully about what not to do as well, John. And I've had a chance to participate in Washington, D.C. in a program known as the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. It's headed by a wonderful fellow and colleague, a member of our coalition, as a matter of fact, who's here, Greg Mitchell. Many of you may know him. Greg has been given the duty of trying to proliferate these organizations, including here with the Visegrad group, to foster inter-religious conversations in the hope of promoting religious freedom. And I just want to say, as an admonition, particularly at a moment when the group is being started up here, something I've said in Washington, something I've said at the ministerial meeting, to any other audience I can get my hands on. Don't confuse religious freedom, the way we mean it, with the conferring upon some who claim, in the name of their religious freedom, the right to deny other religions their freedom. There is a lot of that going on. at the moment, as you may be aware. And what worries me about institutionalizing these arrangements, they're sometimes called interfaith dialogue by some of the worst of the practitioners I'm speaking of, is that they risk becoming institutionalized vehicles for protecting the ill freedom or ill liberty, if you will, of those who are supposedly partners in trying to promote religious freedom. And lastly, I just will say, I am increasingly mindful, and I've learned much from Paul Marshall and Nina Shea on all of these issues, but I am increasingly concerned that we are looking at the reality of persecution of Christians becoming evident not just in Europe. Baroness Cox will speak of that, I'm sure, in a moment, but also in my own country. And in the first instance, as Paul has said, it takes the form, not insubstantially, of conforming to Sharia blasphemy restrictions, which proscribe us from talking about so many other of the problems that are associated with that particular ideology and its intolerance. So I just want to emphasize that I've learned much from all of the people here and want to praise them for some of the comments they've made, second them, and urge that in terms of what we need to do now, it starts with, I think, holding the persecutors accountable. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. And now we're fortunate that our final speaker has arrived. I need to borrow from show business a description for you, which is a living legend. You began life, you began your professional life as a nurse. Quite quickly, you were a major figure in raising social issues in English life. You were appointed to the House of Lords by, I think, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in '82, and ever since then, you have been active in all manner of humanitarian causes, and that work has been recognized by any number of prizes and commendations. I gather, Caroline, that you have a PowerPoint presentation to show. So I welcome you very warmly and invite you to speak.
Well, can I begin by saying Kosoman Sapan, and thank you so much for being Hungary, being so overtly and courageously and inspirationally Christian, and for taking such a robust and much, much, much needed stand for the persecuted church. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for letting me speak this afternoon, John. All I'd say very briefly, you've sort of half introduced me, but I'll do the other half because it just sets the scene. And that is, I always say I'm a nurse and a social scientist by intention, a baroness by astonishment. Because I was not into politics. I was the first baroness I'd ever met. And you become a baroness by being appointed to the House of Lords. And I look in the mirror and saw a baroness looking at me. And I thought, what a privilege, how do I use it? And I think God gave me a very clear message. It's a wonderful place to speak in Parliament for those who cannot speak for themselves, or who can speak whose voices are not heard. So I set up a small NGO to try to provide aid and advocacy for victims of persecution who are largely off the radar screen for political reasons or for risk-averse security reasons. And just to highlight a little bit of the challenges that NGOs can do in combating religious persecution and in helping the persecuted. Next, please. Thank you very much. And just figures, actually, these are understatements. Now, there's many, many more Christians suffering persecution, different kinds, communism, fundamentalist Hinduism, political Buddhism, and militant Islam. Next, please. Thank you. And the thing I would say to churches in comfortable Christianity back in Britain, what about this response to this message of St. Paul? When one part of the body of Christ suffers, we all suffer. Do we in Britain, in comfortable Christianity? Not enough. Next, please. And there shall be saints and martyrs. And what a privilege to care for brothers and sisters on front lines of faith in various countries. We work Armenia, Syria, South Sudan, and Nigeria. We're not visiting all those this afternoon. Next, please. But that is our little organisation, Heart, and that's what we do. Thank you. 3 approaches. One good practice is sharing missions and mandates and helping the persecuted church and helping with sustainability and financial support. We're very small, there's only 4.5 of us in Heart, but we work with partners and they multiply what we give them amazingly. Second, what we can do is name and shame. And thirdly, take legal action if necessary to support the persecuted. Next, please. First example, good practice in sharing missions and mandates. Thank you. Armenia, the first nation to become Christian in 301. Next, please. Suffered so much over the centuries. The first major genocide of the last century. Western Armenia was annexed by Turkey, and Nagorno-Karabakh, a little bit of historic Armenia, was relocated by Stalin in his salami tactics in Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan decided it wanted to get the Armenians out with ethnic cleansing in a bitter war from 90 to 94. Thank you. That is a little land. If you hadn't seen it before, I'd never been there in my life. I've now been there, I think, 82 times, so I now know where it is. Next one. But that war, Azerbaijan fired 400 Grad missiles a day onto the little capital city, Stepanakert. One can do that. Imagine what 400 a day will do. Thank you. Low-flying aerial bombardment with huge 500-kilogram bombs with parachutes so they'd explode on impact. I'm afraid that house was a result. The two men had been brought in from the front line because the guy in the blue jeans, it's his home, and under the pile of rubble are his pregnant wife and 2 little girls. It was the highest intensity conflict of the early 90s. We always asked local people, what's your priority? And moved from war to ceasefire. They said, please help for people with disabilities. They gave us a bombed-out old building. There weren't any that weren't. Thank you. And it's a place of new life, hope and healing for the hopeless, beauty from the ashes of destruction. Thank you. Vardan is a guy in the flowery shorts. He's an inspirational director. 2 of my grandchildren are in that picture. So important to engage the younger generation. Next, please. Marietta, the tissue repair nurse, brilliant. Thank you. Hydrotherapy pool, the only one in the region. Thank you. A wonderful creative use of litter, mineral bottles, making a sun filter for where the little kids play. Thank you. And is now recognised as a centre of excellence across the South Caucasus. And recently, the director of the International Committee of the Red Cross went and visited and said it was 40 years ahead of any rehabilitation centre she'd seen in any of the many countries where she's worked. And after decades of Soviet Union's communist totalitarianism and Azerbaijan's Islamist oppression, this is an inspirational development, spreading hope and healing like a light on the mountainside in a very dark part of the world. And it's like a light, and that's a photo taken in one of their 13th century churches. Armenians love praying with candles, so it's a light on the mountain, shedding its hope and healing far beyond its little territory. Next, please. The second thing that we can do, as whatever capacity we're working for the persecuted church and with governments, is to name and shame with evidence gathered by humanitarian aid work. Thank you. This is an example back from that war in Karabakh. I was there when Azerbaijan was illegally using cluster bombs, and I showed a minister of the day a photograph of children shredded by cluster bombs against international convention. Next, please. The answer I got, no country has an interest in other countries, so only have interests. We have oil interest in Azerbaijan. Good morning. Imagine how that tears your heart out. You've been there for the suffering, and that's the response you get. I've often quoted this in the House of Lords with the emphasis that I'm ashamed to be British. I can understand commercial and strategic interests, but the British people do not want these at the price of cluster bombs on children. So, sad, sad, sad. And moving into the third approach, legal action to protect Christians and to prevent religious discrimination. Thank you. One example at the moment, which is ongoing, legal action is currently being taken by one of our former Archbishops of Canterbury, Lord Carey, regarding discrimination against Christians, awarding refugee status for Christians suffering persecution. Thank you. And the example here this afternoon, because we've been visiting Syria a lot, and we also do quite a lot of work in Syria, discrimination against Syrian refugees. Of 20,000 Syrian refugees to be settled in the UK, it's estimated that 99% are Sunni Muslims, 0.7 are Christians, and 0.3 are Yazidis. That's a serious discrimination against Christians, despite resolutions from the House of Commons and the House of Lords that Christians and other religious minorities are facing genocide. So the reason for the low numbers of Christians is that the selection by the UNHCR is primarily due to cultural animus to religious minorities in Muslim countries and the broader, unconscious or conscious, corruption within the UNHCR itself. Often Christians seeking assistance from the UNHCR are physically blocked from entering UNHCR offices by locally employed Muslim security guards. And the policy can and must be reversed. The plight of Christians overseas is a pressing concern, and the destruction of the Christian communities in the biblical homeland should, we all agree, be prevented. And as we finish, Heart is tiny. It's only 4.5 of us in Heart. We work in a large number of countries with local partners. They are the heroes and heroines on the front lines of faith and freedom. We could, looking around the world, be just so overwhelmed. You could say, well, what can I do? You just shrug your shoulders and look away. But our motto is, okay, I cannot do everything, but I must not do nothing. And if together we all do something, we can have a privilege of making a little bit of a difference for our brothers and sisters on those front lines of faith and freedom. Thanks for letting me share the pain and the passion.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Baroness Cox. We've had 5 extremely powerful contributions. Each one of them, I congratulate you all, has kept within the time limit, which is most unusual at a conference, and they've all made distinctively individual points on each occasion. So what I'm going to do now is, first of all, go back in the following order, sort of the opposite of order, but beginning with Caroline, and just raise, we've had a lot of very good analyses of particular problems and why and what we can do about them. But there's an underlying problem, isn't there, that faces everybody on the platform and in the audience, and that is the failure of very pleasant, decent, principled, secular, liberal officials, the kind of people who operate civil servants in the EU, but all international organizations and in governments, and their failure, I mean, not universal, but the general failure they have of appreciating, first of all, the influence of religion in everyday life and on historical events, and secondly, there does seem to be in them, and particularly oddly because they're often socially active people, there does seem to be a compassion gap on this particular issue. And I wonder if you could speculate, all of you, beginning, Caroline, with you, on what lies behind this and what could be done about it.
Well, 2 hypotheses. First goes back to why I was first appointed to the House of Lords, which was the growth of Marxism-Leninism in the UK, in higher education, but in many other spheres of life. It was very active. It was actually much of it prompted from and funded from Moscow. It was serious and it was devastating. And I think that created the kind of ultra-aggressive secular humanism, quasi-Marxist ethos in much of our society. And the people now in key positions in government, in civil service and professions and so on, they are the generation that were trained like that way back in the 1970s when I wrote a book about it. I wrote a book because I could foresee this coming. And I think, like nature abhors a vacuum, I think spiritual nature abhors a vacuum. And Marxism particularly focused on the destruction of faith and the destruction of family. And that's the vacuum we're living in now, which is being taken over by other ideologies. And just the other point I'd make, and I'm sure colleagues will probably take this up as well, is the political correctness. Our government is terrified of being called Islamophobic. People speaking in Parliament are terrified of being called Islamophobic. So it's very hard to address some of the real challenges. I'm not against Muslims. The other half of my life is trying to protect Muslim women in Britain from the awful application of Sharia law in the UK. So I love Muslim women. But you see the Sharia law growing, and that is a very, very serious threat to our liberal democracy, our political, cultural, and spiritual heritage.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Well, John mentioned that I came to this in a somewhat unusual way, and that is primarily through work we have been doing on contending with various totalitarian ideologies over the years. And in particular, really picking up on what Baroness Cox has just said, we spent much time trying to explore and illuminate and then counter a phenomenon that I describe as Sharia supremacism, which is an affliction, first and foremost, let's be clear, on Muslims. It is practiced by a whole host of organizations that are notorious now for their violence, and one that's not as well understood to be every bit as much of a threat, that engages in what I think of as pre-violent activity, the Muslim Brotherhood. And in my own country, and Britain, and in so much else of the rest of Christendom, if you will, the Muslim Brotherhood has been using subversion to promote political correctness, a technique that they have honed and practiced in concert with the left. I think of this as kind of the red-green axis. They have different end states in mind, to be sure, but they are perfectly prepared to join forces, despite their differences, to accomplish the common purpose of destroying, well, really Western civilization as we've known it, certainly democratic civilization. And this brings us to the question that John has asked, which is how is it that we are so averse to recognizing and addressing and countering this phenomenon? Political correctness, if you will. I believe that in no small measure it is because of the success that the Brotherhood has had in penetrating and influencing from within governments like that of the United States under previous administrations particularly. The net result of all of this has been we fail to recognize the problem. We are incapable of addressing it as a problem. And we are very, very much susceptible to its triumph as a result, not so much because of their victory over us through violence, at least immediately, but through subversion. And I think, John, this is one of the reasons why we're having such difficulty addressing the problem of anti-Christian persecution, not all of it at the hands of Sharia supremacists, but by some estimates 80%. And we need to both recognize it for what it is, and as Carolyn has said, you know, the Buddhist counterparts, the Hindu counterparts as well.
Thank you, Frank. Sam, perhaps I can put a particular spin to you on the general question I've asked. You've recently completed an advanced degree at Cambridge. Universities in America and Britain are commonly thought to be the cold face of this particular problem. I was wondering if you could give us some idea, impression of how true that is, and if so, how you and others who share our views are able to combat it, deal with it.
It's a very strange place, the academic bubble. I think there are a few academics in here. I mean, it's fantastic, but it very often feels slightly removed from reality. We talk about these atrocities as, we say, oh, that's very interesting when we talk about some of what's going on in the world, as if it was some academic exercise, when in fact what's really going on is heartbreaking and awful, when there is a compassion gap. But I think credit where it's due, there are those, and the reasons that they are studying these issues is because they care. And there is a place for people approaching the issues that we're talking about from a different angle. I spoke about the importance of the voice of the local people, but of course it's still important to have academics and others looking into these issues. I was also thinking about in Westminster in the UK that there is a compassion gap as well, but our former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, he launched an inquiry fairly recently specifically on this issue, on religious persecution, Christian persecution. And one of the report's findings was the importance, as Father Benedict mentioned, of religious literacy. It's not necessarily that there's a default lack of compassion, it's just that there's not necessarily enough information. They're just not aware of what's actually going on and the scale of religious persecution. So I think, credit where it's due, that there are those who really do care, but I think there is a need for religious literacy as well.
Okay, sorry. I'll probably repeat some of the things said before. One is a lot of people in journalism, civil service, even academia, are still in the grips of secularization theory. That the world is becoming more secular, religion is disappearing. This is simply an old, false, discredited theory. But many people still think that. Secondly, touched on is fear of being called Islamophobic when addressing persecution in the Muslim world, or we'll probably get that when we address developments in India, perhaps not China. That's, I might say, I probably spend more of my time working with Muslims. And I work a lot with Muslims in Indonesia. And in terms of accusations of the problems with Islam, I just quote them. And if anybody else, I say, oh no, he's the General Secretary of the world's largest Muslim organization. I'm just echoing what he said. So that's one way of tackling that. A third is, Frank talked about this, the sort of red-green alliance. There is a tendency amongst the people we're talking about, let's say they don't like pro-life people, they don't like people with traditional views of marriage, so they see them as their cultural enemies. And then this gets projected on Christians overseas, who may have similar views, but really that's not what they're pushing. They're trying to stay alive while they're being butchered. So you get a projection of Western culture wars onto the world at large, and that's one reason for the lack of sympathy.
Yes. Thank you. Father Carley.
Well, as I said at the beginning, when you get to be the end, everyone's just said, and Paul just took my major point. I think that's
I'll take it back.
That's I think I'm speaking as a Catholic priest in a sense, not representing the Catholic Church, but Orthodox with a small o Christianity. I think the central reason, John, you said, these people are very nice, they're very educated, etc. Why do they have this attitude? I fear that in the West, that is the central reason. It's the Church's, Orthodox Christianity's teaching on human sexuality. That is why we are perceived principally now as the enemy. When a vacuum exists, I remember Pope Benedict speaking about Europe, spoke about a spiritual vacuum. Remember, the EU constitution refused to allow any mention of Christianity at the heart of Europe. And when a vacuum appears, of course, it's filled. And the new ideologies that are filling this vacuum are religions in their own way now. We know that climate change, religion, is really, if I can quote, at the last conference here just a few months ago, Douglas Murray spoke, and he had a great line. He said, if we heard that a Scandinavian teenager had emerged from the woods wild-eyed, breathing fire, that the world would end in 12 years, we'd say, those Middle Ages were a terrible time, weren't they? But we know St. Greta Thunberg. It's filled, a vacuum is being filled, and also the vacuum of gender ideology is filling and becoming a new religion. And the Church is still the only body really that is, as it were, the enemy. And so I think that's part of the reason. The other thing is you can be highly sophisticated but still be evil. We could all have a very nice dinner tonight with Reinhard Heydrich and a few of his companions, and probably listen. Reinhard Heydrich, of course, was an accomplished violinist. We could have a lovely discussion about art and culture, while he, of course, was gassing millions of Jews. So I'm not saying all these people are evil, but a spiritual vacuum has been created in the heart of Europe, and it's being filled not with good things.
Thank you very much. I think we have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to do 2 things. Well, I'm going to just ask if there is a question, one question only. Well, of course, the lady behind you as well. We'll take, actually, there are 3 questions. Let's take all 3. And then, yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is a quick one, and it has to do with blasphemy laws. And in Europe, there are several countries that have what could be seen as blasphemy laws, criminalizing religious insult or insulting someone's religion. And in fact, it's usually Christians who are bringing the claims in those cases. So, for example, a case has gone to the European Court of Human Rights relating to the desecration of consecrated hosts by an artist in Spain. And it was brought by a Christian lawyers group. And from my perspective, these laws will always be used to hurt Christians in the end. So I think European countries should get rid of them. But I wanted to know your thoughts about that.
If you could press, and then there's a gentleman just over there as well. Yes. And
this morning, I think it was Ambassador Brownback talked about religious freedom, including religious freedom for secularists. And it makes sense that the freedom to believe, to be meaningful, needs to include the freedom not to believe. But my question for you is, today, will religious freedom and its related concept, freedom of religion or belief, survive the onslaught from anti-religious secularists? In the US, for the first time, we're seeing the Democrats in the Equality Act try to put into law that in order to establish sexual identity, sexual orientation and gender identity as protected categories, the law proclaims that it would override the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So with anti-religious secularists, are we now seeing one time, one vote, and once they're voted in, they may want to try to do away with religious freedom? Or does religious freedom have a future as a concept?
And the gentleman over there. This gentleman.
Thanks, everyone. I wanted to be the voice of the people today. I'm a Lebanese Christian. I'm from these Christians you're talking about today. I want to ask you how to institutionalize, how to make this vibe of today carry on and on for years to come. Because as Sam mentioned, when Westerner or Western supporting agencies leave our area, we will be left alone and persecution will carry on and we will be hit again. So we want to see practical solutions on how this support can be institutionalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask everybody to speak for about no more than 30 seconds, beginning with Father Kiley.
I think I've probably answered a couple of them anyway, but I agree with Ellen and this lady here as well. I think we're facing real challenge. As Viktor Orban said this morning, don't imagine it's not coming to Europe. It's actually already here. So that would be what I would say.
Yep. On the subject of blasphemy, yeah, I would get rid of all of those laws. Christians might use them, but as you say, they'll come back to bite you much worse. The United States has no hate speech laws. And its speech is not noticeably worse than Europe. I mean, those things simply don't work. To quote Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, the English comedian, it says you just, put a rock over this, seething cesspit of scorpions, and they're still there. So I'll do that, and then with Jennifer's question, the World Evangelical Alliance and the Indonesian Muslim organization Nahdlatul Ulama have formed a joint working group. They didn't want to do dialogue, find that boring, and said, we've got common enemies, let's work together on them. Who are the two common enemies? Radical Islam and radical secularism.
Yeah, thank you. Sam?
Well, thank you to the gentleman who's come all the way from Lebanon, and it's really good to have you here. And I suppose the picture is very bleak, and we know that it's bleak, but I think the message that we would want to put across is that to be encouraged, that you have many brothers and sisters who will continue to campaign on your behalf and on behalf of persecuted Christians. It's not easy, but what was it you said? We cannot do everything, but we must not do nothing. So I think that's what we will continue to do, not do nothing.
Blasphemy laws are being institutionalized in the West to a greater degree than even you've suggested. The European Court of Human Rights found in a recent case involving a friend of mine, Elizabeth Sabatish-Wolf, that offending religious feelings trumped all other rights to free expression in the European Union. That's on the books now. That builds on other laws in various nations. Paul's right, we don't have this hate speech problem at the moment in the United States. We do have the First Amendment, which is one protection against it, but we also do have hate crime laws on the books, and hate crime is basically defined by hate speech. So it's a fairly short step, and there's a lot of people who want to get us into the full-on hate speech prohibition business, most especially the red-green axis. And I want to just underscore the point about radical secularists. They're about taking down the country, not just our constitutional rights. And lastly, I guess one point that it seems to me is self-evident, though not easy to do. You have to protect the Christians that are being rehabilitated or having their towns rebuilt or having their churches rebuilt. It's not enough, as you say, to give them that stuff and then walk away.
Thank you. I think my answer is a need for constant vigilance and constant response. Just give one little story, a good night story. It was quite a few years ago in Britain, and a bill was going through Parliament, and it was nothing to do with religion, but there was a little page, and it would have made it a criminal offence up to 6 years in prison to say anything negative about Islam, to say anything positive about Christianity, because that gives offence, or to make jokes about Islam. Luckily, we saw it. We might not have seen it. It began in the House of Lords, and we mobilised an informed pressure group. I also sometimes have a good idea. They often allied racism and Islamophobia. They don't go together, it's irrational. But I thought we'll deal with the racism one. So I got all the heads of the black churches to come to a meeting in the Asian churches. And the day of the second reading, the main debate on the bill, they all gathered outside Parliament. It was chaos. I hadn't got permission for a demonstration. I had to go to the Metropolitan Police Officer and say, I'm awfully sorry, sir. I think this has something to do with me. He said, you've not got permission for a demonstration, my lady. And I said, I know, but it's the voice of the people. I only met them last week. I promised there'd be no trouble. Anyway, they all gathered on the other side of Parliament. They sang Amazing Grace. You could hear it inside Parliament. Afterwards, the police said, brilliant demonstration, my lady. You can have as many as you like. So, and I needed them too. But also it meant I could stand up and say, let no one call us racist. But of course, the fundamental threat of freedom of speech remains. We managed to get what I call the Freedom Amendments on in the House of Lords, went to the House of Commons under Tony Blair. They were determined to remove the Freedom Amendments. All the black churches mobilised again. They lobbied, they changed the minds of 9 Labour members of Parliament. When the vote came, the first vote to remove those fundamental freedom amendments, and I'd been in prison long ago for just saying anything critical about Islam. It can be academic, it's not hate speech. Anyway, the First Amendment was lost by 9, and then the whips got busy, and the Second Amendment to remove those fundamental freedom amendments was lost by 1 vote. Our freedom hung on a thread that night. But it's coming back in all the other forms which colleagues have referred to. It's not going to go away. So my answer is constant vigilance, and the minute you detect something, you've got to act, or it will have happened before you've managed to stop it. And we'll have gone one step further down the road towards irreversible loss of our cultural, spiritual, and political heritage.
Well, perhaps I can end on an optimistic note, which is to say it isn't. The threat isn't going to go away. It's going to be there a long time, in fact. But the resistance to the threat, it seems to me, is growing as well. And you will have seen, Caroline, the police case, the court case recently last week in London, in which a judge is asking some very testy questions about police action in recording as a hate crime something which isn't a crime in the first place. And second, when he said, when I look at the evidence, it doesn't seem to have any element of hate in it either. So what are the police doing? Now, the judgment has yet to be delivered, but I do think that's one sign of an increasing anxiety about the threat to our cultural liberties. And I think that when we have, if we ever solve it completely, that gives us a better basis on which we can reverse the policies and get Western countries to bring in policies rather more similar to those which, fortunately, the Hungarian government has been doing. And a final suggestion, and people will know the answer to this, do we have in the comfortable Christian churches you talked about in England, Caroline, do we have anything like the twinning of churches between them and the churches in the threatened parts of the world, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq? Because it seems to me that that is one way of not only getting Christians to be aware of what's going on, to feel more active sympathy is required, but it'll also be a message of some hope for the Christians who are actually under threat.
From my own experience, I find it easier to get support for the persecuted church from our brothers and sisters suffering persecution. I hope to go back to Syria in the not too distant future, and 2 leading Anglican, the Archbishop of Jos, a wonderful dynamic archbishop, and the Archbishop of Wau in South Sudan. They want to come. And it'd be actually wonderful for Syrian television, because you don't see many black people, and they will really stand out. They're both dynamic men. To try to get English churchmen there, I mean, Andrew Ashdown was here, but ones who are currently in office, no success. So I think it's a real challenge for our established church, but I think there are individuals and also churches in other countries who will stand alongside the persecuted church. But I'm afraid comfortable Christianity is dominated a little bit by ideological, shall I say, correctness.
Concerns of another kind.
Concerns of another, that's why it's probably, yes. And you've heard more already. But it's a problem in Britain.
Yes. Well, I want to thank the 5 speakers. I think in the space of an hour and 15 minutes, they've given us an absolutely wonderful picture. They've given us solutions. They've given us reasons for hope. I hope the gentleman from Lebanon feels that that is true, because his view of that is far more important than mine. But thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank them.